Let's bring in former Army General, now advising defence industry, Gus McLachlan, who's live in the studio with me. Gus McLachlan, thanks for your time. Let's start with Annalise's report there that Richard Marles saying US subs won't be based here. Were you surprised by that, or does it make sense?
I'm not surprised by the question. Frankly, I think Australia goes into these AUSMIN talks in a different position to perhaps where we've been for a number of years, in that we're now pretty important to the Americans. There's a genuine sense of this Pacific pivot that's been talked about for a long time. You'll recall, Prime Minister Gillard announced the basing of US Marines. We were going to see US aircraft operating out of Tyndall, and eventually the extension was we would see American ships operating from Garden Island. I think what we're seeing from Mr Marles is a slight nuance on language. We will see US nuclear submarines frequently operating through and being supported by Australian infrastructure, probably accompanied by a submarine support ship. They just won't be based here permanently.
So like the marine rotation that you referred to previously, they're here regularly, almost permanently, but on a permanent basis, but with the infrastructure provided by the Australian ADF.
Well, I think over time, when we generate our own nuclear submarine capability, there's a whole range of infrastructure that has to come with that at the moment doesn't exist here. So the Americans will bring their own support capability. But the clear signal, just as it is with the US Marines in Darwin, the clear signal will be that we'll see increased US capability operating from Australia, both maritime, air and land. And I think that's signalling a closeness in the relationship that sends very clear messages into the region.
Well, we see another meeting between Defence Minister Marles and Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin at the Pentagon, which happened just in the last few hours, last 24 hours. We've discussed it, you and I, over months, the AUKUS arrangement, and I guess Annalise focused there on the subs. What will be the Defence Minister's top priority as he meets Lloyd Austin?
The AUSMIN talks, which I think have just been completed, and that's where the foreign ministers and defence ministers of both countries come together. And then usually the two ministers break out into follow-on talks, and what we've seen is Mr Marles go down to the Pentagon for the follow-on talks. Look, my feeling is this one will be quite different to meetings in the past. A lot of people won't have picked up, but in the most recent Biden defence policy statement, the Americans admitted for the first time that they can't win two wars at once. It's been a long-standing policy position of theirs. They can now win, one fight at a time, which explains a lot of why they're being very careful not to be drawn too much into the Ukraine crisis, because there's potential that leaves them exposed elsewhere. What that means for countries like us, we're much more important as an ally than perhaps we've been, when America was almost a unipolar power. So I think Mr Marles probably goes into these talks in a different position as a partner that brings important capability, important relationships, and of course important geography into that meeting.
After the bilateral between Australia and the United States, you've got then the UK, the British Defence Secretary Wallace joining them as part of that AUKUS arrangement. How is that very complex security pact tracking?
I have to confess I was a bit sceptical because I wasn't sure what was really going to occur underlying. We knew there was a significant element of that was the nuclear submarine. I am starting to hear, though, that there are some significant gates that have been opened as a result of it, particularly in the US, but in the UK, the bureaucracy can often resist transfer of technology. A particular congressman who might have a defence industry in their state could often resist the release of manufacturing capability to partners, even close partners like ours. I am hearing some significant easing of those back-end restrictions. So while AUKUS is not an alliance per se, it does appear to have very high-level leadership coverage. When the US president directs that change, I think we're starting to see that meaningfully flow down. So putting a third leg on the stool, bringing the British in and creating a new system. What Ukraine has shown us is the Western industrial complex is really challenged at the moment. Full-on industrial war between nations consumes material, bombs, artillery, rockets, etc., at a rate we have not been prepared for. Australia's stock holdings of those things would be depleted in 2 or 3 days under the current rate of effort in Ukraine. All of a sudden, the three nations have to get their heads together and make sure that their industrial capability is up for what is a much more significant challenge.
I'll ask you about that Ukraine situation specifically in a moment, because I am interested to see where things are as they head into Christmas and winter in that battlefield. But before we do, the 2+2 talks in Japan later in the week. So we've gone from Washington to Japan with Defence Minister Miles and Foreign Minister Wong. How do you see the Japan relationship growing? Is there scope to grow over coming years?
There is, and there has to be. We need Japan to be out there in the world behaving as a fully fledged global citizen. You'll recall the previous restrictions on Japanese deployment of power as a result of World War II. The simple reality is, as part of this balancing a more assertive China, Japan is very important. Its geography is critical. They're already inside what the Chinese call the first island chain. They are effectively inside that chain, so relationships with Japan are important. Japan have played a critical role in this area of critical minerals. China's have used their economic power to drive down the economic viability of critical minerals. The Japanese have played an important role in shoring up the economic position that Australia and the US and others are taking. So I think the Japanese are increasingly important. They bring real capability. They're very they're very good at what they do, and we need them playing the full range of roles that we want to see in the region, balancing some more assertive kind of presence, particularly after what I call the Pelosi incident, where we saw that display of Chinese aggression. The Japanese, I recall you had the Japanese ambassador in here soon after that, really expressing their dissatisfaction with that action. And I think we're going to see, Japan more involved in balancing, and that's good for Australia.
Now, on to Ukraine. You mentioned that the use of the ammunition, the intensity of it. I read this week, I think in the Financial Times, it was an analysis of how much ammunition had been used. Within a few days, the Russians in Donbass had used as much as the British have in stock. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was an important study by the RUSI, the Royal United Services Institution, doing an analysis of the early stage. Quite a frank document, an important one for all policy planners in countries that need to learn from that experience. And what it describes is Ukraine was really vulnerable for a period there. Their stock holdings of old Soviet-era ammunition were depleted quite quickly. There was a gap where Western aid hadn't flown in, and that was the time when we really saw the Russians starting to stabilise and, in fact, advance significantly. It was only the arrival of Western capability that we saw empowered that counterattack phase and the long-range missiles. Now, the Western material arrived just in time based on that report. What we've all learned, the rates at which these resources of war are being consumed are well beyond our kind of peacetime stockholding levels. Not just the UK, it would have been the same if you'd overlaid that on Australia. And so what that means is the days where we're all a bit protective of each other's defence industry, an American congressman or a British politician might not want something, a capability exported to Australia, I think they're behind us. I think we're going to have and all three countries lifting their production so that if we're needed, we're going to be able to bring the weight of... It's really a deterrent capability. If your adversary knows you've got 3 days of stock holdings, well, they don't have to survive long in a conflict.
We're almost out of time. Just quickly, how is the Ukraine military effort holding up as we speak?
They are remarkable, but I think it's not as this war isn't over. There are locations that we're hearing that the Russians are still significantly pressuring Ukraine forces, particularly in the Donbass. Winter will be brutal, and so keeping up Western support, making sure that those Ukrainian troops have the best equipment and supplies that they can to get through winter, and of course that the population can hold up. Still plenty of work to do, but I think Ukraine is winning the ground war. It doesn't mean they have won the war, but there's significant progress being made.
Former Army General Gus McLachlan, thank you for your insights as always. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Sharon.